Hi everyone, sorry about that. I lost internet connection. Um, so I'm just going to go ahead and start. I would like to say thank you all to our generous sponsors for donating towards this event, and without whom this event would not be possible. I would like to also begin by acknowledging that I am currently on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganyeke Haga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which I am gathering today. The Choctaw or Montreal region is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. I respect the continued connection with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Before we start, I would like to remind everyone that there is live captioning and American Sign Language interpreting available for this event. To turn captions on and off, click the CC Live caption along the bottom of your window. You can also adjust the size of the font by clicking on the 3 dots at the bottom of your window that say More and selecting Subtitle Settings. We also have a sign language interpreter that should appear as a panelist on your screen when you are signed into Zoom. If you experience any issues at all accessing the captions or interpreters, please send a message to all panelists in the chat. Additionally, I wanted to say that if you have not been able to attend previous events, such as the African Neuroscience Research Panel and the keynote address by Dr. Woods, these events are available on YouTube, as will be today's events and the events later on this week. You can also share any highlights that you've learned from today or on social media using the hashtag BlackInNeuroWeek 2021 or BinW2021 and hashtag BinW21, as well as hashtag NeuroRacism. We are here to participate in the highly anticipated Neuro-Racism Journal Club event, in which we will be discussing the preprint racial and ethnic imbalance in neuroscience reference lists and intersections with gender. This journal club will be led by Dr. Damien Fair, a highly esteemed computational neuroscientist at the University of Minnesota, and one of the co-authors of this paper. Joining me today, as I like to introduce myself, I am Ifka Adedife, a neuroscience master student at Université de Montréal or the University of Montreal, and I am the incoming secretary at Black in Neuro. And joining me today is the Black in Neuro co-founder and organizer, Tiago Arzua, a PhD neuroscience candidate at the Medical College of Wisconsin, as well as Emanuela Bassi, a rising neuro junior major at the University of Texas at Austin, and Black in Neuro social media manager. I will now give it over to Dr. Damien Fair, who will be leading the rest of this event. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. Let me get my slides up here. All right. Well, again, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a privilege. I've been following the Black in Neuro crew for quite a while on Twitter, and just so impressed with all the work that's done and how much people have come together under this umbrella. It's really been empowering, and I just really appreciate it. I love to take your lead. I'm excited to talk about this paper on racial, ethnic, and gender imbalances and references in scientific papers. That was led by a friend and colleague, Danny Dissect, Max Bertolero, who's now I get to work with, and Jordan Dworkin. I get to, at least for these two of the authors of these papers, I get to put up some funny pictures of them because they have their own very fascinating personal stories that you all should definitely learn more about. They're amazing scientists and intellects, and also just amazing people. All right, so I decided to for this journal club to think about it in terms of three goals. One, I decided I'm going to say, let's make it personal and talk about a personal story about why systemic bias in neuroscience and publishing really does matter. Then I'll go over the paper, and it's not just about these specific anecdotes, but the actual proof is actually in the data. And then I'll end with a bit of some ideas to think about what we can do about it, based on personally, lab-wise, institution-wise, and so how we can correct some of these items that we're seeing in the literature of inequities. All right. So let me start with a bit of a story. I've never really told this story, particularly in this context, and only one really other time. But I thought it was a really appropriate forum to talk about this, because I think it really hit home why the topic that we're talking about today really matters. So this is Oscar Miranda Dominguez. He in 2012, I brought him to work in the lab as he's a biomedical engineer. He's originally from Mexico. Now I put a lot of the text of the stuff I'll be describing on the slides, because I'm not exactly sure how this may be distributed in the future, and I wanted people just to follow along. But so Oscar was able to get a PhD in the U.S., using a scholarship from Mexican University that required him to return after a specific number of years to go back and teach at that university. If he didn't, he had to pay back all the money he got to get his PhD. So he prolonged that commitment after he finished his PhD to enter my lab, where he was a basic scientist and a researcher at heart. Now, he probably would have been the smartest person in the lab, but at the same time, this other fascinating Black and neuroscientist, Marguerite Matthews, AKA, at PhD, he's also joined the lab and said, no, I'm the smartest person in the lab, and so it was. Now, what Oscar brought to the lab at that time was a series of insights on how to model what we call resting state functional connectivity data using MRI. where you can get these, these very intricate, patterns of brain connectivity that tell you a lot about how the brain is organized. One of his first projects was to develop these types of models that could specify with very high precision, just with the function of a person's individual brain, who that individual was. You could identify him out of a lineup with 100% accuracy, next week, a year, 2 years later. We called that concept a connective type, for like in other words, like a genotype of the brain, or a functional fingerprint, a concept that at the time was not necessarily considered to be possible, particularly in studies of development, and that's one of the main topics of my own lab. We thought it was a very big idea, that it had very big legs, but also that we had to move fast because Oscar's time was running out. The only way you could avoid, having to leave, we had a family and children, and couldn't afford to pay back the loans, was if he had a big paper, a big splash, and then was able to get a job, as an assistant professor. So here's the paper, the connected typing model-based fingerprinting of the functional connectome, that showed, that it's an approach that's capable of identifying individuals based on brain connectivity with 100% accuracy, that the approach is robust and can be obtained in limited amounts of data, so very limited amounts of fMRI data, and that the specific systems in the brain, one called the frontoparietal system, is most highly variable amongst kind of individuals, is driving that individuality. So we pitched the paper around to a bunch of journals, in 2014, but it didn't go that well. Okay, here's the editorial rejection from Nature Neuroscience. So thank you for submitting your manuscript, and after careful consideration, we regretfully conclude that this paper is not suitable for publication in the journal. While we are no way questioning the validity of your work or its interest, we are not persuaded of the strength of the novel conclusions that can be drawn from this work or sufficiently justify publication in Nature Neuroscience rather than a more specialized journal. Well, we ran out of time. Oscar couldn't find a job. He had to go back home to Mexico and teach. And we eventually published the paper in PLOS One, a lower impact journal, but in part because we just simply had to get it out there, and he was now gone. Now, a year later, I got a call from a reporter asking me about this new paper in Nature Neuroscience called Functional Fingerprinting. Functional connectome fingerprinting, identifying individuals using patterns of brain connectivity. Where the paper showed it's an approach capable of identifying individuals based on connectivity, that it's robust and can be obtained with limited amounts of data, that a specific network in the brain, the frontoparietal system, is most highly variable amongst individuals, and which, in essence, a lot of the similar results. So there's more to the story here, and it's actually a very, very good paper. And the good news, of course, is that the paper replicated the prior findings with more traditional methods of machine learning, and more. The bad news, at least for Oscar, from his perspective, is that he's really not getting the credit he deserves for the ideas and concepts that came up. And if you actually look at, since that time, the citations of these two papers, it is drastically different. And from just 2014 to 2015, you can see just here is how much of an impact this whole concept and idea really faced. Okay. Now, of course, the point here is not to bash the authors of the other paper who have been just amazing, very successful and impressive findings on these concepts. They are actually very close friends and colleagues. Same with the editors at Nature Neuroscience. That we've worked with in the past. In fact, the first author of the paper is a female, who you'll see is likely also disadvantaged just because of her gender in general. But the point of the story is to highlight there are real life stories behind the numbers that we're going to talk about today. And the statistics that we talk about have real implications. They really do matter. The currency in our space, in academics, are papers, citations, and grants. So I tell all my trainees, whether it's fair or not, careers are often started and progressed based on this currency. And the balance of being able to cultivate this talent, and losing it in science is extremely fragile. Any disadvantage to the access of the currency stifles progress towards equity, but I think even more importantly, it just simply limits our scientific discovery. And here's why. When I won the MacArthur Award, I tried to capture this. I was able to give one quote about winning the award, and this is the quote I gave because of how important I think this actually is. So here it is. So every step towards a deeper characterization of brain function brings advances in healthcare, education, technologies, economics, and other enhancements in our society that deeply touch our lives. The progress, though, will not come with the homogeny of ideas, education, experience, and culture. We need to embrace variability, our diversity, and provide access to pursuit to all the talents that exist in our society. And in fact, it could be argued that the driving factor of discovery and advancement of nearly every civilization has been the result of human variability, where some outlier, oftentimes being of minority status, pushed us in a way that no one could have ever imagined. Ironically, in our space, in the sciences, our ability to proportionally value the importance of that variability has been limited. And I'm hopeful that we can, based on this juncture in our history, that we can harness our privilege and awareness and embrace the change of course. Now, luckily, in the end, we found a way to get Oscar back here, and now he has a lab at the University of Minnesota as an assistant professor. In fact, this is him yesterday, training and teaching one of our summer students about the same topic that he from that early on paper. But I just wanted to open up the discussion with this story in order for folks on the call to put in our minds, beyond simply the statistics and the numbers, that there's more to the story here, because frankly, what we're talking about today actually really, really does matter. Okay. All right. So here's the paper, and the proof. That's one anecdote, but the proof is actually in the data. So I'm starting with the prequel to the initial paper that we're talking about today. It's called the Extent Drivers of Gender Imbalance in Neuroscience Reference List. I got a lot of these slides directly from my friend Danny Bassett, who is an amazing storyteller, and so I lifted a lot of her. I asked her and then lifted a lot of her slides for this talk. But it is a really good example helps us understand the nature of the main paper for the Journal Club today. So here's the approach, okay? You examine the authors and reference lists. They examine the authors and reference lists of just over 61,000 articles published since 1995 up to 2019, I believe, okay? And then what you do from all those papers is you assign a man or a woman to each author depending on the probability that they can be labeled as a man or a woman based on the name. And there's some databases that can be used to essentially do that. Now, of course, in terms of gender, this binary classification is not well accommodated to intersex, transgender, and non-binary identities. And I know that the primary authors of these papers consider this a very important characterization of the data. Okay, so here's one of the first results. So gender of authors over time, like how has that changed proportionally in the literature from 1995 up through 2018? Okay. Now the first thing for this is the way that this was done is you have to split the data, or the data for each paper, into 4 categories. You have first authors and last authors, and it's either MM, is man, woman, man, WM, man, woman, MW, or woman, WW. Okay, and that these colors here correspond to those different 4 categorizations. Now, what you can see here is that across these articles, the proportion of articles with a woman as first and last author increased from 95 to 2018 at a roughly, just over half a percentage point. Okay, so that's good. But then we say, well, then you have to ask the question, relative to that proportion, are women actually undercited? And to do that, what you do is for each of 31,000 citing papers between that time, you can take you take a subset of those citations, from in this case, from the top 5 journals, and you bin them into these same 4 classifications. And all the self citations were all removed. Okay, so now it's the same, like you're citing either man, man, woman, man, man, woman, or woman, woman. Now, to make the actual measurements of over under citation, you need to have a baseline. And so to do that estimation of any of these 4 categories, you need to calculate what you would expect by chance. So if I went and grabbed and just randomly cited, a bunch of papers that came prior to when my paper was published, what is the random chance that you'll get a given proportion of one of these 4 categories? So to do that, you calculate the gender proportions among all the papers published prior to the citing paper. You can multiply that by the number of papers cited. And then to determine if you're over or under, you just subtract the observed proportion, the exact proportion in the paper, minus the expected proportion that you got based on that prior, the random draws. Okay. Now here's the first result, and that is that the male papers were overcited by about almost 12%, and you can see the distribution here. In the woman papers are undercited by almost 30%. That's pretty big. But then the question is, of course, is this simply because there's differences in gender regarding the paper type? Okay. So the paper type means like when it was published, what journal it was published in, the number of authors. There's all these different characteristics that exist from the paper. So then you can control for that by comparing from a similar type of the idea of random draws from similar types of papers in this category to control for these possibilities. And the gist is that the patterns are somewhat attenuated, but really, if you look closely and you can see the numbers on the right and the actual numbers here on the left, is that the pattern remains. So then the question is, well, what is the characteristic of the authors who are doing the over or under citations? Okay, who are they? Well, you find that the imbalance of the reference list shown is largely driven by citation practice of male-male teams. Okay, so here's the male-male teams and their citation practices. Here are the female teams and their citation practices. Okay, and you can see that the general pattern is the same, but it's largely driven by this group of authors. Now, are the trends getting better? Of course, there's more women, authorship over time. Are the trends as far as this imbalance actually getting better? And the answer is actually no. The imbalance within these references is actually increasing over time. Here are the authors, male. Here are the cited authors here from male to woman, and these are the male citing authors, and this is the women citing authors, and you can see that the imbalance is actually increasing over time, and actually not getting better. And that is again, it's the case if you squint in both groups here, but it's really being driven by one group. Okay, so that actually brings us, and it is the introduction. It really tells the concepts and the methods about how you can look at the same idea with racial and ethnic imbalance in neuroscience reference lists, which was primarily done by Max Berlero, but a large group of team. Some folks are greatly well known and good friends and colleagues. Koff and Bianca, of course. I was brought into this project a little bit late, but I was just happy to work with a lot of amazing people on putting this together. All right, so to do this, now we have to it's not binary whether you have male or female, but now we need to assign race or ethnicity. Okay. Now there's a publicly available probabilistic database and a deep neural network that can learn the relationship between names and racial ethnic categories based on voter information, census information, and Wikipedia entries. Okay, and that's what was used here. And the approach allows you to give a probabilistic or a probability of across these four racial or ethnic categories based on the author's first and last names. Remember, so now here are the categories. You have white author, white author, white author, author of color, white author, author of color, author of color. Okay, so across the first data point here, so across these 63,000 articles, okay, between 1985 and 2019, we see that the proportion of articles from a person of color as first or last author is increasing at a rate about 0.5% a year, similar to what we saw before. That's pretty good. Okay. But now we're going to compare in the exact same way we did with gender. We're going to do that compared to this random draw, or the expected rate of citations, to see if there's any if our authors of color are over or under cited, and if so, by whom. So here is the first, and the first answer to the question is against all types of citers, is that authors of color, again, and similar to the women scenario, are undercited relative to the white counterparts. Okay, well, who's doing the over and under citations? Well, well, here's, you can see here again, it's similar to before, but maybe a little bit more drastic, is that the patterns exist across all people who are citing, but is higher or more largely driven by white citers. Okay, is this simply because of differences in gender regarding the paper type? Same thing as we saw before. Okay. The answer here are after controlling for these paper characteristics, and the patterns remain the same, and it remains similar, although not identical, between white and citers of color. Are the trends getting better? The answer again is no. Now again, this is across both groups, but again, it's primarily driven by white authors who are increasingly citing white authors and decreasingly citing authors of color. And you can kind of see these trends you can see these trends as we over time. You go here, a little noisier than you see in the prior paper. Okay, and the last is there an actually interaction of race and gender? Okay, and it's a nice little graph. The red over here is over citations. The darker blue is the under citations. And you can see the first authors are over here and the last authors over here. But I think the main point here, as you start digging in here, is that the effects that we're seeing are driven by are driven by both race and gender, and there seems to be a combinatorial effect that if you're a author of color and a woman, you have by far the biggest impact on this. Okay, and that really is the gist of this story here, and is something I'm hoping that we can discuss throughout the rest of the day here today. Okay, so the last piece here, and I'm going to do this really quick because I know we're kind of out of time here, but what can we do about it? Personally, lab-wise, institution, I'm hoping that some of these things I'll talk about here can help engender some additional discussion. Okay, so the data here highlight that there's these fundamental issues regarding racial bias in our neuroscience institutions. Okay, A, this is not equitable and it's putting folks at a disadvantage. But B, because of A, the science in the progress is actually being limited. Okay. So these truths should be enough incentive for ourselves and our labs and our institutions, that includes universities, journals, funding bodies, right, to systematically address the issues of this systematic bias. Now, the authors of in the lab and Danny's lab have done a pretty good job at putting out some tools for mitigating some of the disparities in this culture of in improving the culture of awareness here. There are good examples and instructions, or and highlighting the importance of actually including diversity statements in our papers and within our institutions. There are now programs, both as Chrome extensions and standalone programs, that can help you evaluate your own papers and where you land, where your citations list land on these scales, for both gender and the one that we've been working to implement here at the University of Minnesota, and race. But then the question is, what are some of the other institutional changes or things that we might want to think about or discuss and consider today? So, should citation rates and the number of and the profile of papers be so heavily factored into our employment and promotion? Is there an institutional problem just on just the fact that we have to look at this topic? Is that should be thinking about that? Are there structural incentives that funding bodies can actually encourage people to equalize the playing field here? Okay. Are there structural incentives that journal editors can encourage to help us equalize the playing field here? I think these and a few other questions I'm hoping that we can get to and talk about today. But I'm gonna end there so we can kind of have some additional discussion here from the other speakers. I want to just say again, how appreciative I am of this group, for everything that you're doing. You're driving us in a better place, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I'm just in awe of just following it and just talking about it and just seeing how successful this whole enterprise has been. I feel privileged to be able to speak to you all and to talk about these important issues. It's very dear to my heart. I'm glad it's getting a megaphone, and we owe it all to you. So I just thank you so much for allowing me to be here and speak and be part of the discussion. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fair. I guess we'll just start with the discussion. I don't know whether you want to start with actually the questions that you left on your slideshow, or whether there's an exact point that we want to take it from here.
Yeah, I think we have two amazing. I would love to hear, maybe just to start off with some initial reactions from the other panelists, and then we'll use that to springboard into some broader thoughts, and maybe discuss or other things that come up as part of the broader discussion.
Yeah, sure. I would love to start off. Just like my initial reaction, I think although it's obvious that racism stems not only or persists not only through our institutions such as government or education, but the fact that it also persists in our scientific community itself. And just seeing the actual data reflecting the things that I already know is just so important to actually have and to actually visualize and validate the experiences that I have, that many people of color as well in science have in the community. So yeah, I think that was really cool.
Yeah. Thiago?
First of all, I really appreciate the story that you told in the beginning. I myself am an immigrant here on a student visa, and in order to get my permanent status here, I will have to get like basically evaluated by the U.S. government as far as citations go, as far as like impact factor of each journal that I publish goes. So I really appreciate that. Um, and I have like just general thoughts of how on the paper itself, like how in figure one, basically we're seeing like, oh yeah, it's getting better. Like, right, that's the first gist that we get from the paper. Like, look, we're getting more people cited. And then you get to figure three and you're like, no, it's not. It's really not. And I wonder a lot as I'm reading through this paper how that reflects, and be kind of harsh here, but like how that reflects kind of like the failure of some of the programs that we've seen so far, some of the pipeline programs that not necessarily like end up with someone having a tenure track position, or programs that will get grad students into grad school and then not make sure that they can succeed in grad school, or get more diverse postdocs and not make sure or not guarantee that they're going to be successful postdocs. So those are my initial thoughts of like how that might be reflective of how we're not doing a well enough job. Maybe we have more people, maybe we're increasing our diversity, but we're still not there. We're still like not making sure that these people are being heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are extremely important points. You know, in it's funny because in a lot of my, I'm involved in a lot of institutions. You know, so of course I have my university. I'm part of some very big, you know, national studies that we call our own institution. You know, I have, you know, there are a lot of different. You can see that there is certainly a struggle to tackle this. Oftentimes we tend to try to identify this program or that, but it's almost like you have like a big wound and you're just trying to take a bunch of little band-aids and put them all together to stop the bleeding, you know. And it seems like there's some fundamental, you know, aspects of the infrastructure and what it means, you know, how we value success is what really is going to drive the needle necessarily, instead of these one, you know, some of these specific things, you know. For example, you know, when you're getting promoted, just like your story about what you needed to have a visa, it's almost every university is almost identical. You have these very unique categories that you need to hit in order to kind of reach to the next level, and related to your science and your teaching often and your service. And there are some universities, in fact, I think it's Indiana, Purdue University, or Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, who are starting to add another category, and that is what you're contributing to DEI initiatives, as part of your promotion. These are kind of, I think, to me, it's like there's like kind of fundamental, aspects that are going to really drive the needle on this. And I think that it speaks a little bit to exactly what your point is, Tiago. I mean, I agree. Manuel?
Yeah, so for me, I really appreciated this paper because it shed light on a topic I don't normally think about every day. And I really liked how it acknowledged that responsibility doesn't only lie on those in positions of power to make the change in the reference list. It also lies with those submitting papers for publication, screening their own reference lists, and making sure that they reflect people of color in their work and acknowledging it and doing so. And then another thing that was also really cool to see in the paper was how lack of inclusive environments, or environments that are actually welcoming to people of color, can actually in turn affect retention, and then not make available mentors for young people like me wanting to go into the sciences, because that can then lead to potentially not people like me wanting to go into the sciences and actually pursue what we want to, because we're not seeing that representation. And it's not encouraging us to actually take on those positions or go into those fields because we don't see people that look like us. I really appreciated that acknowledgement in the paper.
Yeah, that is another just a very important and insightful, contribution. You're exactly right. A lot of times a lot of the, I don't want to call them band-aids. I don't want to, say a lot of the work that folks are doing is not important. But there's, again, that's part of some of the broader structural issues that are making a lot of these initiatives struggle to be super effective, right? And some of that is just community, space. There are some programs, in fact, there's an NIH program now that I think is relatively clever, called FIRST. I don't know if many of you have heard about this, but it's this new grant. I think they just had the first round that just got finished. And what they're trying to do is trying to do community hiring for, encourage or provide a lot of funding for community hiring at universities. So oftentimes when people are trying to increase diversity at their own institution, they'll have a given department, or somebody will go try to pluck, you know, a person of color for the, you know, but of course, when you do that, you know, you're bringing somebody into an environment that is already not diverse, you know, and there's lack of community, lack of structure. But this program, the NIH is trying to rethink that model a little bit, encourage people to do kind of group or cluster hires, where they have many hires all at one time who come in as a team to start building their own community from the ground up. That's just one example, but I mean, but I think what you're talking about is extremely important. There's one figure I didn't show that's related to that in the paper too, and that is it uses graph theory, and you know, graph theory is all about the study of, you know, nodes that are kind of connected by, you know, lines or edges. In this case, the nodes are the authors, and the edges of whether they're connected or whether they're co-authors or not. And you can use these kind of networks of authors to identify and use these clustering algorithms. In this case, they use this one called InfoMap, which identifies kind of clusters of folks who are linked or tightly linked based on their co-authors. And what that data showed, they showed it over time. There's some measures of what's called modularity that can be used to tell you how strong those links are. But the point of that figure in that part was to show that how, you know, as we grow and as we have an increased number of citations and publications over time from persons of color, that who you're publishing with is becoming more segregated into based on ethnicity and racial groups. And I think it's very much likely that part of that is secondary to a lot of what you just described, Manuela. And I don't think, again, that is good for the science either, you know. So that's a very good point. There is a question there's a question in the chat that I have here. And the question is, you know, is it reasonable when serving as a manuscript reviewer to suggest that authors use some of the free tools to examine their citation practices in your comments? I have my own opinion on that, but I'm gonna ask some of the panelists to see what they think, and then I'll go from there. Does anybody want to try to answer that?
Yeah, sure, I can go for that. I think immediately when you brought that up at the end, like I think it was near the end of your presentation, I think the first thought I had was, I think it'd be really good to actually have an objective measure of the quality of your paper, just so that when you are going to publish it, or when you are bringing it forth to another journal, if you do have a feedback that doesn't reflect that quantitative measure, it kind of gives you more confidence to actually refute that, to actually go forth and actually ask for a second opinion, or ask for clarification on why you got an answer that doesn't reflect what you know your paper is worth. So I think there's definitely some value to having that, for sure.
I completely agree, and just given my short career so far in academia, I feel like this is not that much to ask for. Reviewers ask for much more sometimes. That there's like a high power imbalance between reviewer and reviewee. So like I think of all the things that we've seen so far in academia that like reviewers could ask for, like asking for a more fair citation strategy wouldn't be so much. We see. I think this is anecdotal for some of the things I've been through, but like we know that there are reviewers who would ask to be cited kind of point blank. They're like, you haven't cited all these papers from the same lab. So we've seen like this going the wrong way. I don't know why we couldn't use this as a positive tool.
I share the same sentiment, definitely making sure that reviewers can use those tools to start inducing change, because as the paper mentioned, even though the field is diversifying, there still is a significant lack of people of color and Black people in particular being cited. in papers. So I thought it'd be a really cool thing to start implementing on the reviewer's part as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree as well. I mean, it's one thing to demand that somebody do it, right? Because there's a lot of caveats, and it depends on what the specifics of the context. But suggesting that they do it, which is mostly what reviews are, is completely appropriate in my opinion. And I think it just, again, half the battle is awareness, and so doing that in our reviews, and I'm glad it was brought up as a question, because I have not done that before. Everyone's like, oh, I should do that. Providing some awareness to the authors, regardless if it changes their practices or not, I think is certainly reasonable. So let me ask another question that I'm very curious from the panel here, related to this topic, which I think is actually my first question at the end of the presentation. Okay, and that is, the heavy reliance on citations and the number of papers and high profile papers, do you, what is your, as far as how these are integrated into graduation, employment, promotion, visa status, what is your opinion on that structure? Should it be that way? Is that how we should be measuring success? And if not, what are some other ways that we could be measuring success, of our scientists? You want to give it a shot first?
I can go. I used to think that was a fair way, that like citations, and not just for reading the paper, but in general before grad school, I used to think that citations were completely unbiased, that it was only about the science. And then you see things like, a certain lab that gets, every time it publishes, it gets cited thousands and thousands of times. And you also see things that are, I think, more inherent to the system. So like big labs with like enough funding for certain types of studies, they will always get cited. Papers that have like multiple authors that like obviously are going to publish on Science, on Nature, on Neuro. So it's really not a fair competition as far as like the value of your science. That being said, I don't think anyone of us will have like an easy answer to like how to measure it better, how to evaluate it better. I think one thing that I'm very positive of, it's just being on those spaces. So one of the questions that we had on the Q&A was, how can journals be more equitable? If your journal editor is aware of these issues, if your journal editor is aware that the citations are completely biased, or that like promotions, grants, all these things are biased, if the people making the decision are aware of this, I think they're less likely to do those bias mistakes. But at the same time, as you showed in the paper, that might drive, I'm not going to call it segregation, but that might drive the separation of these nodes more. It's kind of sad. It's kind of sad that by trying to be equitable, we might all just be ended up citing like trying to cite ourselves, like our own groups. So I don't know. It's a very hard challenge to try to be positive about this and try to say like, okay, we can do these things, but if the current situation of like why male authors not citing doesn't change, it's hard for us alone to do all that job.
Yeah, I think you got it. This is a very tough question, and I've been thinking about this a lot, in part because, for me, one of the things I think we're challenged with in our science is oftentimes the science it's negative. Our results are, our ideas are not as great as we think they are, and oftentimes they don't get published, in part because they don't, and there's lots of things I think we can change to how we incentivize, good practices that improve the science. But it's a hard question about how to do it. I'm going to ask another question that also came up in the chat. Now that I can see these a little better, that I think it's a very good one. It's going to make you guys think. So here's the question: we keep using terms like POC, but there are big disparities between Black and non-Black people in academia with respect to representation and struggles. So do you think there's a time to use the umbrella terms, and there are times when it is beneficial to speak about the specifics of Black scientists and Black scholars?
Honestly, this might be a bit controversial, but I don't love the term POC a lot of the times. I think it kind of hides the nuanced oppression that each particular group that falls under the umbrella term POC actually experiences. So I think I think just in the future, I would encourage, or I would promote actually looking at each group as they occur underneath that umbrella POC term. I know there's also the BIPOC term that also pops up here and there, but again, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, for those who don't know. And I think the same problem occurs is each oppressed group, each minority group, or racialized group in this instance experiences their own unique struggles, their own unique sets that present themselves differently when in the scientific community. So I think it is important to, when we actually are addressing these groups, to address them in their own groups instead of as a group as a whole. That would be my opinion on that.
I like that idea as well, just making sure that in our conversation and in our dialogue, we distinguish between different groups, because as Ife highlighted, we all don't have the same struggles. Black people may not face the same things that Asian people may face or Hispanic people may face, but I guess amplifying what we go through in the context of what we want to discuss it in is really important. And I guess just not putting us under one umbrella term, even though it might be convenient to do in conversation as you're going, but just having it at the back of your mind, like, hey, like this is what I'm experiencing that's respected to what identity or group I belong to. And that'll help other people resonate with what you share as well.
Yeah, I think you guys are very wise in your words, and I completely agree. I'm going to bring up another question for you all. And I'll help answer this too, but I think it's a good one relative to this paper. So it says, thank you for the paper and highlighting disparities in ethnicity and race in sciences. For women of color, like myself, who have started experiencing these barriers and getting publications and citations, how would you recommend tackling these barriers?
That's definitely a hard one. I can't think of anything at the top of my head.
The first thing that kind of comes to mind is, I guess, trying to keep other scientists within your network accountable. Maybe if you know like someone that's close to you is about to like submit a paper, be like, hey, like let's like go through that reference list. If they're comfortable with it, of course, there'd have to be consent involved in that respect, but just keeping other scientists accountable before things are submitted to ensure that there is representation within that reference list. And so one solution.
Yeah. I think, providing awareness, being vocal. I also think, and this is what I encourage everybody to do, is particularly for our young investigators who are really our future, is do not be skimpy on the advice. Of course, everybody's going to have an opinion. You can't treat everybody's opinion as gold, but you need to kind of do a really good sampling to help you navigate very difficult issues, including things like this, because there are a lot of different perspectives. There's going to be very unique scenarios or circumstances. And so I always recommend, of course, everybody's got their scientific mentor, obviously, but, you never can be short of mentors, to be honest. And go get out there, ask for advice or to regularly meet and just get opinions on things that you're going with. And you'll hopefully, for very specific issues that you find, particularly if it's related to getting your work out there and making sure you're being heard, that there's going to be someone who's had similar scenarios and wish they would have done this or could have done that. And so, kind of really doing a good sampling of any peers, close or far away, with Zoom, I think is, and of course, other senior folks is going to be really important, to tackle some of those difficult issues. There is a comment here about sending us the links to the tools to evaluate the citations. I think we can probably do that. You know, I think probably what
Those are on the
maybe a way
paper
to-
too.
What's that?
So those are on the paper as well. So they're by the end of the paper.
Yeah.
The links to all of those.
That's right, and we probably associated with it's actually if my slides are available, or of course the live stream at the end where you see them, they have all the links there, and you can easily just grab it from that too. So this is another good question that it's probably good to tackle real quick here. Is the attendee says, I used the online tool to evaluate my citations. I found the benefits of I found it very eye-opening. But it did misidentify the race of someone that I know. She found it very troubling because I brought up some issues she had with her own identity and how people perceived it. Similar issues for people who are misgendered by it, because any tool is going to be imperfect. I guess my question is how can we get the best use of these tools without ignoring the impact of mistakes? I think it's a very important point. Like I said, I know the developers and the authors, very well, and all these tools are very imperfect. I think there's two things. One is shedding light on the issue to be able to kind of provide more awareness is certainly step one. And step two, and it's going to take a village, right? And a community is to start thinking through identifying people really interested in this particular scientific topic to help improve the resources available to help folks, gain their own awareness. I think this is like version one, right? It's like the iPod probably, and then there's going to be new versions and hopefully new hands that come in to help fix some of those mistakes, because they're certainly to occur. Okay, so here's another one that so we only have 2 minutes left. We only have a couple minutes left. I'll make just a final comment for myself, just real quickly, that I really enjoyed the conversation here, that the discussion is great. We couldn't get to, there's a ton of question and answers that are going on in the chat. We couldn't get to them all. We apologize for that, but thank you all for attending. And I'll now let our panelists, who are amazing, to be able to sign off as well.
I guess I'll go. It's always weird determining the timing of things, but I just wanted to say thank you so much. Like, I definitely wish we could have gotten into this more, because there's so much to say. But I wanted just to say thank you to you, Dr. Dinife, and just all my panelists as well. I enjoyed this thoroughly, and I'm hoping to continue this on social media.
It was really great getting to be here and share this space with you guys for this time. I also agree that there is a lot more to unpack from this paper and just the issues in general, and really gotten to spend this time with everyone.
I'll just echo their words. Thank you so much. I'll also say this: it's not your job to fix the whole of academia. You're not going to do it by yourself. Don't stress. I think we have some great examples of people who are saying no very publicly nowadays, and I think it's very nice to see Black women saying, no, I don't need to do this. I don't need to do whatever it's asked. And yeah, it's not your job to fix everything. This is going to be a community and a societal level change, not an individual one.
All right. Again, thank you all. I am in Minnesota at the Masonic Institute for the Developing Brain. We are looking for young, amazing neuroscientists. So hit me up if you're looking for a job, any level. All right. Take care, everybody.